Hello, lovers. It's Jess, and welcome to season 3 of Remodeled Love, the podcast. Now, before we get to this episode, which I'm very excited about, I have to tell the truth about myself. The audio on this episode is not ideal. See, what happened was I went to my new co-workspace and the podcast equipment was not set up yet. So I quick threw a microphone into a room so that I could chat with my friend Sam over at Shrimp Teeth. And I sound like I'm in a tin can, and I should have known better. By season 3, this should not be happening. But guess what? We're all human. And this conversation is so good. It's way too important and informative to miss out on. So guess what? We're kicking off season 3 with it, baby. The theme for this season is thriving in our imperfections. Enjoy.
I fall in love just a little bit every day with someone new. I fall in love just a little bit every day with someone new.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Remodeled, the podcast. I'm your polyamorous mama, Jessica-levity day lover, and with me today, I have to fangirl a little bit because I have been a huge fan for so long that even when you followed me back, I was a little like, anyway, with me today is Sam from @Shrimp Teeth. What up?
Hello, I'm so happy to have you here. Yeah, it's been like multiple weeks of just chatting back and forth trying to get this to happen. So I'm so happy that we're finally sitting down to have this conversation.
Me too. And I'm really excited about the topic. So you actually are the one who had the idea to do this. And I was so honored, so stoked. And tell everyone what you reached out to me that you wanted to talk about.
Yeah. So I wanted us to really sit down and kind of debunk the peer support question. There's a lot of debate online, especially in non-monogamous spaces, about whether or not peer support is ethical, who should be doing peer support, if it replaces therapy. And I was like, you're a peer supporter, I call myself mentor. I don't know. And we can get into, I guess, some of that language too as we get into this discussion. But the idea was really to just help people understand what peer support is and really define what the limitations are so that we're all on the same page.
I love this. And I hope that not only, because you mentioned that this will be a great resource to point people to when you get the same question over and over. I'm hoping the whole community can point people to this piece of media right here. So I'm really excited. So tell me what you feel like peer support within the non-monogamous community is.
Yeah. So, and I mean, we'll go a lot more into like our backgrounds and how we got into this, I'm sure. So I won't dive too deep into that right now. But for me, peer support is really a like casual space that is resource based to help people navigate with a lot of the common questions that come up when they're opening their relationship. So it's about saying like, we have lived experiences navigating jealousy, even just talking through terminology. And we've read a ton of books. We've listened to a ton of podcasts. We know who the licensed monogamy friendly therapists are. So I'm here to just point people in the right direction with all of the questions that they have and just don't know who to talk to. So that's the first big thing. And then the second thing is I'm just here for people who need to vent. You know, sometimes they're annoyed at their fucking partner because their partner is off doing weird stuff and they don't want to bitch to their partner. So I'm here to listen as a completely neutral third party who's not involved in the situation and doesn't necessarily have any kind of stake in the outcome of these conflict points.
I think you really covered all of that so perfectly. I agree with all of that. My spiel is the way that I divide peer support is into several parts. The first part is that I am trained based on my educational background and my coaching background to ask questions that I think that somebody might not be seeing. And sometimes we don't need an answer. Sometimes we need somebody to ask us the right question. So the first thing I'm doing in a peer support session is looking for questions that I think you might need to be asked. The second thing I'm doing is relating to myself, which as an autistic person, I love to do. And I feel like that's what separates it from therapy. If I had a therapist who was relating to themselves, and I have had that, it's a trigger, it's a no-no. We don't go there. That's what therapy's for. And peer support though, or mentorship, here's the situation. Here's how I've experienced it.
Mm-hmm.
Here's how it felt to me. And here's what I did about it. And if this resonates with you, great. If it doesn't, let it go. And then the third part, like you said, for me is resources. So after the questions and the personal relating, next, I'm going to point you to resources that I think might help you make your own validated self-referencing decision from there. And also I'm really into the venting piece of it as well. I have one of my like fascination topics is shadow work. So I have a huge, long educational history in shadow work and the nature of the shadow and the ego. And part of that for me is I call it getting petty. So pettiness is the gateway to the shadow. And now when we're petty in uncontained spaces, that can be really toxic. It can cast a lot of karma, whether that's a woo thing for you or a metaphorical thing for somebody. And we don't want to do that. But in order to honor the shadow and those dark sides of us coming up, we have to create a safe space to do that. And like you said, I'm a safe person to do that with. So I call it getting petty. We'll have a little petty party. And if you need to bitch about, your new metamor coming in and they're in NRE and it's making you hella insecure, let's bitch about it, right? And bitch about it here so that we don't have to bitch about it out there. And it's a really healthy way to process those tough emotions, where when we stuff those things down and pretend that they're not happening, that's what creates a lot of shadow. That's what creates a lot of unintegrated toxicity. And so I feel like that's how I set up my peer support, very similar to you.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think exactly what you're saying, like there are containers, right? I think this is where the line blurs a little bit between what is like the peer mentor relationship versus a therapist relationship, because people are like, they're not friends, right? I'm not like a personal person. People are paying me, people are paying you, I'm assuming, for these sessions. So there does seem to be like a professional setting, but at the same time, it's not quite as hierarchical as you technically see therapy or other mental health types of services, right? It's like, I'm on your level. Like, I am here to find solutions that work for you. I'm not here telling you what to do. I can give you suggestions, but what I really harp on all the time is that you get to make the decision about how you want to implement these suggestions. Whatever I suggest, you can take it, you can leave it. It doesn't matter. You're not going to offend me. Like, this is your life. You try what works. And if it doesn't, like, we can come back to the drawing board at any point and come up with new ways of thinking through this issue so that it does actually, give you the results that you're looking for.
Beautifully said. I think I give a very similar spiel at the beginning, a disclaimer at the beginning of all of my sessions. And one of those lines I use is, I don't have an agenda. So I'm going to tell you what I'm seeing that I think you might not be seeing, what's coming up for me as a polyamorous person on your level, and someone who has maybe significantly more years than you and has studied much more. And it's like, that's why we go to people who we consider mentors, because it's like, I'm living my life over here designing jet engines, right? And you study polyamory. So when I have polyamory advice, need polyamory advice, I'm going to go to you for that, and you're going to come to me to help you build a jet engine. I don't know why I went with that. But like, I always say, like, I don't have an agenda. And I think that's why it's so important for peer support specialists, mentors, coaches, which is such a problematic term, and we can get into that later, to unpack their shit. And I really encourage people, and I really think that we should be focusing our education on how to interview a mentor or a peer support person. And one of those interview questions should be like, how do you make sure that you don't project onto your clients, and making sure that you have somebody who has done that work, because a lot of times people do have an unconscious agenda. And so making sure that, like, I'm just giving you resources, like you said, and encouraging you to make the choice that feels right for you. And my whole thing is like, I'm going to love you no matter what. So my peer support is based on unconditional love, that you can go make a mistake and you can come back to a session with me, and I'm not going to cast judgment on you for that. I'm going to see you as human and remind you that you're human, and that now we get to make a new choice. And that's where a lot of my specific emotional intelligence coaching background comes into this space. And I think at the end of the day, people are booking a peer support session or a mentor session with you or me because I'm creating content that is resonating with an experience that they're having. And so they're choosing us. And that's where I think things can get a little murky out there, because I do know that there's a lot of power dynamic issues out there, and it's easy to take advantage of people who are in a really vulnerable place.
Yep. And I think what you said is super interesting about like, I'm coming in with no agenda. I agree and I don't, in the sense that like, I agree and I think it's really, really difficult to be objective. The way that I usually navigate around this issue is saying like, I'm speaking about my experience in this moment, right? Like, this is how I went through a similar situation. This is what it's reminding me of. But, and I love to say, I am not you, right? Like, and really continuing to make that distinction, because again, like, it's hard to be a blank slate. I'm not, and people come to me, to your point, like a lot of folks are in straight assumed relationships coming into their queerness for the first time. They know that that's my story, that I was in a straight passing relationship for years and while I was coming to terms with being a lesbian. So people are often like, do I leave my male partner to go be with a woman? And it's like, my answer for myself is absolutely 100% yes. And that's where I always have to say, like, this is an agenda, like I have my answer because that's what led me to my happiness. And I'm going to be real and honest with people about the fact that that is coming into the type of answers that I'm giving, so that people know like where I'm coming from when I'm saying that, and making sure that they understand that that absolutely does not have to be the right answer for them just because it worked for me.
And you know what? I mean, touche to that. And I should watch my language, because of course, when I speak in universalisms, of course, I'm always going to have an agenda on a subconscious level. And I think one thing that I'm really good at, like you're really good at, is constantly reminding people I am inherently, necessarily always speaking from my lens. And that reminds me, I start all of my interviews with a privilege check and an identity check, because my audience knows that there is no such thing as wisdom that is not being passed through the lens of our privileges and our identities. Absolutely. So I would love to just go back, and if you could introduce yourself, who you are, how you show up in the online space, and what your privileges are that you navigate in this world, and what your identity is.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a white, queer, non-binary lesbian. I'm middle class. I'm really lucky because I have a master's degree, so I'm well educated by the traditional, I guess. And yeah, I live in Portland, Oregon with a partner, and that's sort of the way that I'm going through this. I come from an advertising background, which we can talk about too, and how that's impacted and changed the way that I do peer support. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm starting off all of these conversations.
Thank you for sharing that, and for allowing me to like backtrack, because it's so important to what we do here. I also have an advertising background.
I know, and we can discuss this, because I do think that there is something really lovely about, like, I was doing a lot of how do you call this, like focus group work. That's where I got my training in moderation, and it pops up a lot. It pops up in the type of social media content that I make. It's like always filtered through an advertising lens, which seems really unethical when I say that. But then there is like, the reason I left advertising is because I didn't like that field due to the ethical concerns, and being able to say like, oh, these things are really, really fucked up, right? Capitalism, consumerism, hyper-individualism, the way that we're targeting people by demographic, all of these are really problematic ways of interacting with the world. And because we know this, we can kind of shift away from that, use the tools that are actually really useful when we're talking about advertising, right? Communicating content that's super easy to digest really quickly, while addressing the things that are not working. I don't know, what were you doing in advertising? I'm curious now that we've just brought it up.
So my background is in radio. And so I was a personality on a very popular like alternative, is considered American alternative station here in Reno. And I was the person that all the salespeople went to make their commercials, because instead of just being like, come on down to Al's car lot, right? I was creating stories, and a lot of them were very funny. And so all of my 60-second commercials were telling these brilliant stories that had comedy, that had emotion, and they were selling. And I was being paid $10 an hour, and these salespeople were making six figures, and I was being exploited. And I felt gross selling people shit that they didn't need, right? And I started to understand the intersections of capitalism and exploitation, and just being a woman in a every field in the patriarchy, almost every field is male dominated, but the radio is an old boys club, and it's very toxic. And so they liked me for what I could do for them. But there was a limit to what I was allowed to do and grow into as well. And so I left out of that and felt like I had a superpower, that my creativity is a superpower, and I'm a storyteller, and I'm funny, and being funny can be a very manipulative power. I think growing up as an awkward, now I know autistic, like lonely child, I learned to be funny because it won me friends, right? And public speaking is a talent of mine, and it's something I enjoy doing. Put me on a stage with a microphone in front of 10,000 people, I'm going to have them eating out of the palm of my hand. And that's dangerous, because orators in our world can quickly climb to power. And so I became kind of afraid of my artistic abilities and my creativity and my ability to sell you something. And started to I overcorrected a bit to not wanting to use it at all. And then as I became a lot more intersectional and awakening to systems of oppression, I realized that I feel called to use my superpower for good, I guess, to dismantle some of this shit. But inherently, it's always going to be problematic on some level, no matter how much good I think I'm doing. And that's the shadow of it. And I have to stay humble to it and woke to it and be willing to be called out on it at any given time. And, the nature of the ego is to creep in, especially when you think it's not.
Can you talk to me a little bit more about that? Because I am super curious, when we're talking about wokeness and privilege, it does tend sometimes to veer into perfectionism, which is also a huge issue that we deal with as polyamorous people. And that is one of the things you also touched on earlier, when we are mentoring and when we're having these conversations with people, we need to tell them it's okay if you mess up. What we're introducing to you, these topics, these ideas are not perfect, right? They are theories, and you're going to put them into your life in really imperfect, sloppy, messy, destructive ways. And you also have to be conscious of what kind of privilege you're bringing into this situation. We haven't even talked about you said yet, but how does that work with this shadow work that you're doing? I'm just so curious if you want to tell me a little bit more.
Sure. What a great question. I think a couple things my brain is kind of going into when you ask that. So first of all, I think understanding moral relativism is so important. And the more moral relativism being that we're all out here choosing the morality that we think is the most important at the time. So I might be a vegan for ethical reasons, but I'm drinking a Coca-Cola. Right. And I might be like, well, Coca-Cola is not that bad, even though we know they're one of the most evil companies in the world based on exploitation of people and resources. But I've decided that not eating animals is the more important thing. And then somebody might be like, okay, but you're drinking a Coke. And then I might be like, well, you can't be perfect, right? So I have decided where to rate my values, and this makes it all relative. And somebody who is humble to that reality will understand that I might be triggered by the different moral codes someone else is choosing, but at the end of the day, I am not perfect. It's literally impossible to be. Impossible. We are inherently participating in a system, and the more privilege you have, the less likely you are to know which things you're doing that are fucked up, and to feel entitled to it. And so you have to be dismantling that all the time. And I forget the second thing that I was going to say, but just that keeping that moral I know what I was going to say. So keeping the moral relativism in the space at all times. And when you are giving advice, which I never say I'm giving advice, I'm always saying, here's what's coming up for me. And this is what I would do. And then I'm reminding people, I have every mistake you have made, I have made. Every thought that you have had that is fucked up, I have had. So like, there's no hierarchy here. My emotional intelligence training is based in the idea that we were all raised on principles of conditional love that thinks it's unconditional love, which is all founded on codependency. So you're responsible for my happiness and I'm responsible for yours. So when I'm unhappy, I can blame you. And when you're unhappy, you can blame me. And I don't have to take personal responsibility for any of the mistakes that I make because it's all somehow someone else's fault. And so when we're out here making these mistakes, I feel as a mentor in the space, I'm here to remind you, again, there's no mistake that you made that I haven't made, and that I can love you unconditionally because I'm trained to do so. And that you can show up in the space flawed and having made mistakes. And I can remind you that I simultaneously love you and hold that space for you, but also request that you take personal responsibility for the mistakes that you made, and that we take an honest look at the mistakes you made and how they affected other people without taking responsibility for the wounds of the other people, right? It's a balance. And we're not going to sweep things under the rug. So I'm going to allow you to be imperfect, but I'm not going to allow you to sit on the call with me and sweep things under the rug and shirk personal responsibility. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that so much. Yeah, and I think it is really interesting because it's bringing up like the core values that we're bringing into mentorship and how we receive training in order to do this. I don't know if we should talk about that too, because I have a very different approach. The word love is not something that I necessarily bring into my sessions with people. I'm very much focused on like personal choice and then being able to weigh like the responsibility of the choices that you have and how they impact yourself and other people. But I do think that also comes down to how I even got into this work. But yeah, I don't know if you want to tell me about you first. I feel like now I'm taking over the interview. I'm interviewing you, even if you're supposed to be interviewing me. So
I don't feel that way. I don't feel that way. I actually love how this is flowing and appreciate the sort of co-hostingness happening.
I love it too.
I do want to say that I have, as I've moved, because my background is in spiritual counseling.
Gotcha.
So I have in the peer support space, I am very choicey about, am I using the word love and is that going to trigger somebody or feel like too woo or inappropriate? But when I'm explaining kind of the metaphysics of how I'm thinking, that my training is in the idea that we are so afraid to show up as our authentic selves in any space because we were all conditioned through conditional love. And so as someone holding space, what's going on in my head is I am trying to show up unconditionally. But I do not use that word all the time, especially if I feel like that's going to weird somebody out. What was the question you asked me?
Yeah, your training, like you said, you started sort of in a spiritual background. What was that like?
Yeah, so I have a bachelor's degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I have a double major, Bachelor of Arts in philosophy and sociology. With an emphasis in metaphysics. It's like my nerd topic within philosophy. And I have a minor in LGBT and gender studies, which was like a brand new, I think it was the first year it was ever on the books. Like, this is so funny now. And so I was like, oh, I'm going to snag me that degree because gay. And so that was kind of like launched my career in caring. How does the brain work? How do our psyches work? And how do we show up in relation to each other? And what types of energies affect us within a space? I'm a very woo person. I have a deep love for all wisdom traditions. I'm a very lucky person that I don't have religious trauma. So I was not raised in a religion. And so I don't have a specific turnoff. I can honestly see wisdom in all wisdom traditions, no matter what they are. And I have the natural ability to be like, ooh, that's not for me. Gonna let that go. But ooh, that is resonating. Gonna take that. And I give a natural permission to myself to like create a designer spirituality, just like we're out here as polyamorous people creating designer relationships. So I don't have a dogma and I don't have a need for people to agree with me. It's such an intimate experience to me that I don't care if somebody agrees with me. I'm a huge like mystic nerd. So when we look at the Judaic Christian traditions, I'm a huge nerd for the mystic traditions under those. So in Islam, Sufism, the Kabbalists for Judaism, and the Christian mystics. mystics. Love those. I'm going to prefer those over the traditional ones, which I think are just jaded from the mystic traditions. And then of course we have the creation spiritualities, which are ancient and indigenous and witchy and shamanistic. And so I love them all. I'm polytheist, I guess you could say. I'm just poly everywhere. And so as I began to examine my own mysticism after I graduated and started kind of taking my wisdom from my bachelor's degree and putting it into all these other modes, I moved to Reno and found this mystic religion that is entirely problematic called New Thought. And I started on the path of like reverendship within that religion. And that's where I started learning a lot of practitioner techniques.
Gotcha.
And I very quickly was like, this is not the path for me, because they wanted to control what I talked about. And that does not work for me. And so I started going down that path and then entered a lot of different spiritual accreditation coaching programs.
Gotcha.
Of course, everything's made up, right? So I'm accredited, right? But from a institution that made its own accreditation, where I'm showing up for people in a spiritual space in a very similar way as I am in the polyamorous space, which is, here's what I'm seeing, here's what I think you might not be seeing, here's some questions, and here's some resources. I left that world behind, and then the pandemic hit. I'm an entertainer, it killed my whole industry. So I launched Remodeled Love as like this like back burner project, and like of course it took off. And then I've got people knocking down my door going, do you do coaching? Do you do peer support? And I'm like, all right, universe, I see you, right? So I feel really blessed to have the training that I have and to show up in the space very confidently. I'm 36 years old. I'm not a kid. I think I sent you that article I wrote on Medium where I'm like, not some basic white girl, 22, showing up, trying to pitch you an MLM coaching program. Right. Like I am confident in the space. And sometimes I'm on calls where I'm like, holy shit, I am so glad that I have the training that I have, because that could have like been really dangerous or really wreck someone. And I fundamentally know when I'm out of scope.
For sure.
And I will tell a client, this is out of my scope.
And
we can give money back. We can end this call. I can resource you out. I can show up within these ways if you'd like to continue, always keeping informed consent in play. And so also in 2017, I lost one of my most successful projects of all time. That meant the world to me. It was my comedy troupe. Because I was behaving in a lot of really unconscious ways. And we were family, 10 years of playing together as a troupe. And I think they had to wake me up to some really unconscious behaviors I was engaging in as the leader, and in return them as well. And through that experience, we brought in a mediator immediately the day after the downfall happened. And that mediator worked with us and me for 2 years. And that brought in this emotional intelligence piece. So then I went through this emotional intelligence training under their tutelage. And that has woven together this, how I show up in a peer support space. I feel like if you're coming to me, you're coming to me to help you untangle communication issues and areas of emotional intelligence that may be affecting your polyamorous journey. I feel like that's what I create content on. That's who's coming to me. And that's my background. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that makes so much sense. It's so fascinating.
What about you?
Essentially, I studied to be a graphic designer. That's what I wanted to do originally. Went, like I told you, into advertising. My first job, they were like, we don't have any graphic designer jobs. Go and moderate these focus groups for these really big corporations. So I'd be sitting there in these like tanks, like just listening to people talking about like whether or not they want to choose Coke or Pepsi. And like it was really that, and getting deep into like what was driving the purchasing decisions and how people were making these choices. Fast forward, graduated, started working in that, went in for a master's at NYU in consumer psychology, which is under a social psychology umbrella. And that really focuses a lot on like neuroscience and how people are making purchasing decisions. What is driving different demographics to be attracted to certain types of products? And how does this, like enhance people's life or not? And what I started getting really interested in is around the queer identity piece, which was not talked about at NYU at all. As you can imagine, it's a little like bougie, elite, white people, straight, New York kind of shit. And I was like, oh, but as queer people, we are purchasing things on a daily basis that are reflecting our identity, and we're constructing our queerness through the accumulation of these different clothing items, through all of these different like signals. That's how we're finding each other. And there's a really interesting piece to that. Anyways, it was just something that was like floating in the back of my head. At the time, I was like, fuck consumer psychology. Like, this sucks. I was working for Colgate, just like doing toothpaste advertising while I was finishing up my master's. Got super, super burnt out. The racism, the homophobia. I was in the closet because I was super scared of losing my job. Like, I was just seeing how the one gay intern that was out was like not getting hired, even though he was super talented. I was like, I can't do this. Move cross country and wanted to do art therapy. That was sort of like how I ended my master's, was just starting to take a bunch of art therapy classes. And as I was getting into the like licensing portion of it, doing the ethics classes, starting to think about like whether or not I actually want to go through and become a therapist, I was like, you know what? No, I don't. I do not like fundamentally agree with a lot of the licensing board's practices. I don't agree with the way the DSM has been used to just like brutalize people for years and years and years. There's just so many of these things that I was like, this is all fake. Like, it is constructed to just uphold these social hierarchies that I just do not agree with. I don't want to be a part of the system. Not to mention like the insurance, the cost of therapy is super prohibitive, blah, 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 blah. There's like all of these different things. I was working at a nonprofit company here in Portland doing art as a non-licensed person with people, with children essentially, who were in the hospital, and just like working with their families as they're going through like chemo surgery or chemo treatment and surgeries and all these like really, really hard issues. And people were confiding in me. There was like a lot of just like holding space for people to have these experiences. All the while, my relationships were evolving. It went from like, I was, having a don't ask, don't tell with my ex-husband, where we were seeing people but not really talking about it, to finally we own this house, we're living together, we need to like actually talk about the fact that I have other girlfriends and that he has other girlfriends. And so we started becoming polyamorous, and I was just doodling about non-monogamy, kind of still from that advertising perspective of just being like, here's a little blurb that you can look at in 3 seconds and understand. And people kind of like you just started asking me a bunch of questions, and they're like, can I talk to you about this situation? And I was like, fuck, I don't know, like I guess. So I did that for quite a while without charging people money for it. I was like, you know what, we can just like hop on the phone. I don't know what value I can bring to you, but let's go ahead and have this. And then getting more granular into it, I was like, oh shit, this is going back to this focus group moderation stuff, where I am helping people see like, okay, there's swinging, there's monogamous relationships, there's polyfidelity, there's relationship anarchy, there's all of these different types of relationship structures that people don't understand. And there is a choice for you. Like, you get to make this, you get to look at your boundaries, you get to really customize what works for you in the same way that you are making decisions about other aspects of your life. And let's go ahead and simplify this, right? Then we're bringing in the emotional like part of it, but we can also start from a very like logical way. What do you want in your life? Like, what fits best for you? And that's sort of how I've like approached consumer, or how I've merged consumer psychology into peer support. Is like, there's not a right or wrong decision. Like, you can like Coke, you can like Pepsi, you can like monogamy, you can like non-monogamy. There's not a right answer across the board for everybody. It really is boiling down to like, what makes you feel good? What makes you feel affirmed? What makes you feel like you can show up the most authentically in your relationships with other people? And how can I fill in the like education gaps that you're missing so that you understand what you're actually getting? Because a lot of it is just, like you said, people don't know, right? Like they haven't been reading all of these books. They haven't been studying non-monogamy. So that's kind of where I see myself as just being an information resource. Like, ask me the questions. Well, tell me, do you like having, monoamorous relationships, polyamorous relationships? And let's go from there and start eliminating choices that you don't like and seeing what you can actually try.
When you said like your background is in like consumer psychology, I was like, I don't know how
that fits
you're
in.
gonna like tie that in, but I totally get it. Now the moral relativism comes in, right? That there's no right or wrong. And I think obviously I show up in this space, and I know you show up in the space because I've seen your page where like, yes, moral relativism with a baseline of I will not tolerate I will not tolerate racist, sexist, patriarchal stuff, in this space. I'm going to have that as a foundation. But other than that, as far as the things that you are ethically choosing, and I personally subscribe to the Avita Sawyer's school of let grown folks do what they want, like that's her whole thing on her page. And I tell people all the time, like there's so much gatekeeping in the community where it's not, well, do you like Coke or Pepsi more? You get to choose. It's Coke, right? And like Pepsi is bad. And then, and that could be super troubling to someone who has no idea what they're doing. So I think it's so important to have our pages out here who are really like grown folks get to do what they want, informed consent, do your best, take responsibility, like when you fuck up.
And what I find really lovely about this like choice approach or ideology is that you really do get to work, like I work with couples also during peer support, and then we can have this conversation of like, oh, you really, really like it when you have a bunch of information up front. You like knowing your metamors. That's something that works for you. You get super triggered when, like you're hearing about menopause. Let's go ahead and find a way where those two separate preferences can fit together so that we're not creating an all or nothing kind of scenario, right? Where one person is always being triggered. Like we can go ahead and create a hybrid model where one person is disclosing more information and the other person isn't disclosing as much information, and just being able to put out a lot of these different choices and saying like, you are, as you said, a grown adult, like you get to define what boundaries work for you, and they don't have to be the same as your partner. That's okay. Let's go ahead and find the middle ground. Let's go ahead and find these solutions. And I don't know about you, but when, like you mentioned, I don't give advice to people. I talk about solutions and I talk about 30-day trials, right? So saying like, let's go ahead and try this idea for 30 days. Give it a try, right? Put it into place. Both of you can stick to these agreements for a month. And then at the end of the month, let's go ahead and reevaluate, right? We can say what was working about this agreement that we tried, what wasn't working. The pieces that aren't working, let's go ahead and set a new set of 30-day agreements and go from there. And so we're kind of like helping people along. I'm a really, really big believer that you can't just overhaul your relationship overnight. Like I always tell people, like, do not try to change everything all at once. We're making small incremental changes, right? Like slowly we're discovering what our preferences are, and we're bringing those preferences into our relationship in an additive like way, so that we're building up the relationship rather than tearing everything down and trying to rebuild from scratch. So to me, that's where like all this consumer psych conversation kind of folds into my peer support.
I resonate with so much of that, and I love having this conversation with you because it's like just a different lens of the same experience. I feel like so much of what I'm doing as like a mentor, coach, whatever you want to call it in the space is I always get this image of like lifting the hood of a car, and then like there's all these wires in this engine and everything's all crossed. And for me, everything's all crossed because we were all conditioned in compulsory monogamy, compulsory heterosexuality, and codependency, right? And the codependency is why all the cords are crossed. And so we have no idea how to self-advocate based on our attachment style, our core wounds, our inner child. We're going to have issues doing that, right? So we have to, I'm just going to show you, I'm going to lift the hood of the car because you got on the call. I'm going to lift the hood of the car and I constantly check in. Are we still good? Do you want to move forward? Right? Consent all the time. And then I'm going to show you, hey, this cord is over here. Do you want to pull it out? And why don't you hold this cord and you hold this cord, right? And now we can all look at what we want and advocate for what we want without worrying about the other person. We can all put requests into the space and we focus. So you talked a lot about finding middle ground. And in my practice, we call that common ground. So we don't compromise, we find common ground, right? Similar concepts. And so like, I feel like so much of what I'm doing in the peer support space is one, uncrossing wires, two, showing people where they are not communicating and not advocating for themselves, and where the energy of blame seeps in. And so I am trained as an emotional intelligence aficionado, and this is the spiritual stuff. I don't bring the spiritual stuff into the space unless somebody specifically requests, but blame is an insidious energy. And because of our codependent culture, we are very used to blame and we think it's natural. And so where there is blame, there's a lack of personal responsibility, and that's where the wires get crossed. And so I'm going to show you, hey, there's blame in the space. Would you like to pull that out? And here's how I can help you pull that out. And so I do that. And do you find that so much of what you do as a peer support specialist or mentor is just give people permission to like whatever? I feel like, and I'll tell people too, I'll kind of like not tease them, but I'll kind of say, hey, I don't know if you just paid me to get on this call and tell you it's okay to feel that way, but I am happy to spend 45 minutes giving you permission. If you want. I feel like so much of it is just permission. And I'm honored that you wanted to pay me for my time to do that. And I'm happy to get on this call with you whenever you need to give you permission.
Absolutely. And I think that's such a good segue into the second part of the topic of like, who are our clients? Like, who do we talk to? Because you're right. Like, I find that there's such an incredible range of people that I talk to. You know, some people are coming in and they're like, have never read a book on polyamory, just out here doing fuckboy shit. And like, just my girlfriend is mad at me, so I'm here talking to you as an obligatory situation. But like, just tell me that I'm doing everything right. And in those situations, you're like, great, fantastic. I know what you want, and we can talk about like a few little tricks to help improve this situation. Here's a book you might want to consider reading. And then there are people who it's like the opposite. They've read everything under the like, I'm just blown away. It's like there's no resource that they don't know. And they're like, I feel like I'm not doing enough. And you're like, baby,
Oh my God,
like you're doing so much. Like the smallest like bit of insecurity, they're just like, oh, I must be terrible at polyamory. And you're like, oh, you're fucking crushing it. Like you need to go ahead and give yourself way more like credit for what you're doing.
Sometimes it's permission and sometimes it's validation, and sometimes I've had to cut people off when I have become, and this is something I'm trained to do as well, this is more the spiritual side, is recognize someone is too focused on growth and they're not integrating. Right. And so I see someone has become almost addicted to or dependent on learning, growing, the next resource, the next workshop, the next class. And it's like, I think you're ingesting more than you're integrating, and you're doing great. You're doing way better than you think you are. And you just need to chill for a minute and just let everything come in. So much validation, so much permission. A lot of times there is because sometimes you're right, you get those calls where it's like, I'm here because whatever. And so very occasionally I'll get on a call where I have to let the person know, I don't think that you want to be on this call because you're fighting me on everything that I say. Do you want to talk about what's coming up? And then boom, we're on the actual what's really going on. You know what I mean? But sometimes I feel like people think that they want help or affirmation or support, and then they cannot receive whatever the hell it is. Yeah. Does that ever happen to you?
You know, for me, it's a little bit less about that resistance. Sometimes people just have no clue what they're looking for. I find more of that where you know, they're just kind of happy telling me what's going on in their life, and we just
Mm-hmm.
kind of like dance around topics for
Mm-hmm.
the first half hour before
Yeah.
really ever me getting any clarity of like what is the purpose of this call. And you know, I asked them right off the top, like my first thing, I go into every call like, here's my disclosure, I'm not a licensed clinician, I'm not a mental health professional, I can give you resources if that's what you're looking for, you know, correct me about anything that I get wrong about your life, I don't know you, there's lots of things that I'm probably going to misunderstand, feel free to jump in. And then I tell them like, what are we talking about today? Like, what do you
Mm-hmm.
actually want to get out of this conversation? This is your time, you are paying me. Like, I am here to
Mm-hmm.
be what you want. Like, do you just
Mm-hmm.
want to vent? And there are folks who just have no clue how to answer that question, and I think that that's okay too, right? I think there is so much confusion about shifting relationship styles, about what it means to be in a relationship to begin with, that sometimes like those conversations are a little like, I'll end and just be like, what the fuck was the point of us talking for an hour? I feel like we got to nothing. But usually those folks come back around, you know, like a couple weeks later, a couple
Yep.
months later, and they're like, that was so insightful, it brought like a huge aha moment. And it's like, yeah, sometimes people just need to be able to tell their story out loud, and my job is just to sit there and be like, yeah, let me ask you more questions so that I understand what you're understanding, and let's go from there. But yeah, no, I've had one person in the 3 years that I've been doing this who's like, you're the worst, this is doing absolutely nothing for me. And I was like, that is super fair, here is a refund, and I'm so sorry, I hope that you find somebody else, here's a bunch of other mentors that you
Yep.
can talk to instead. Like, sorry, that was really offensive to you.
Yeah, I do feel like 50% of my peer support calls are people who are like, I don't need any advice. I just have no one in my life that is
Mhm.
polyamorous
Yeah.
that I can talk to. And I just want to talk to somebody about what's happening.
Mhm.
And I'm like, great, get the tea, pour the coffee. Let's do this. Can I eat a snack? And I'm happy to be that person in your life because it's so important to the subconscious mind and the conscious mind to just know that, because as you're, especially in the beginning of the journey, the ego really comes in and starts to fill you with these intrusive thoughts of what you're doing is wrong. It's inherently wrong. And the fact that you don't know anybody else who's doing it means it's inherently wrong. The
Mhm.
power of getting on a call with someone who is very affirming and very confident in what's happening, I think is super powerful. And in my experience with the like resisting what I say, I mean more like they'll say like, my partner's not giving me what I want. And then
Mhm.
I'll say
Mhm.
like, well, have you advocated for what
Yeah.
you want? And they'll go, well, that wouldn't work. And it's just like, oh, like,
Yeah.
okay, yeah, like
Yeah. Yeah.
interesting. And then, I always let them know like this
Yeah.
lifestyle is not for everyone. It might not be for you. And if you are
Yeah.
struggling a lot and you don't feel that you can advocate for your needs, then
Mhm.
perhaps a different relationship where you don't have to advocate for them as often. I don't
Right.
know. Really, everyone's on a
Yeah.
journey and you can't save people from themselves.
Absolutely. You know, I really like that. I just want to talk about like one of the big things that comes up is like people are often asking me the question, like, should I be non-monogamous? And of course, my answer is like, well, I don't know you. Like, should you be non-monogamous? But I usually take them through like this three-step process of saying,
Mm,
like, are you still growing? Right? Are you enjoying the type of growth that you're making? And do you feel like your partners are supporting you in that growth, right? And like being able to deconstruct in a way that people can actually like self-reflect about whether or not this is actually a viable path for them, and then giving them alternatives, right? When they come to the conclusion of like, oh, actually, you know what? Non-monogamy is bringing up a fuck ton of jealousy. Yes, I'm having to do a ton of growth. This is my personal experience. Yes, I'm having to do a ton of growth with this person about my emotional regulation, but like, no, I don't want to be spending 10 hours a week having to like do DBT, like self-soothing fucking skills. And no, this person is not helping me in that process because she's just keeping information and she's trying to audition me for her girlfriend role and being really sketchy. So like, no, this isn't working for me. And then we can say, all right, there's so many other options, right? It's not now you have to go back to monogamy. Here are all of the other types of relationship structures based on what you've told me that could be alternatives that you can look into. Some people really, really like, you know, non-sexual polyamory. That could be an option for you instead. You can have a polyamorous relationship that focuses more on community and friends. Would that sort of alleviate the problems that you don't want to work on? And we kind of go through all of these different steps together to really understand like what is this person's experience, and like not just leave them with, okay, fuck, now I'm found out that polyamory isn't for me. What do I do? You know, it's just like, where else can we try? And let's see if this works. And you won't know until you try it, but here are potential alternatives for you. I don't know if you end up in those situations a lot.
Yeah, very similar. I feel like so much of my peer support experience is reminding people that it's okay to make a choice, that it's okay to try something. I call it being in the question mark. It's okay to be in a question mark, and reminding people you can always make a new choice. Now, every choice has consequences. And so always be giving people informed consent. So if you just met somebody, letting them know, I'm in a question mark right now. I think I might be non-monogamous, but I'm not sure. So that if they choose to stay in that, they're opting in from an informed consent. And then if 6 months down the line, you're like, I'm wrong, I don't think this is for me. You can make a new choice. There's so much pressure we put on ourselves, back to the codependency, to think that once we have to know before we choose. And once we choose, we're in. Right. And just giving people permission to be in the question mark and reminding them they can make a new choice. And as long as you have practiced those choices ethically, meaning you have told everyone you're in a question mark, then what comes up, because I get so much, I don't want to hurt anybody. Well, you don't want to hurt anybody because you're a good person.
Yeah.
And so like, good. But also, you're not responsible for somebody being sad that you realized that this isn't for you and you need to make a new choice, particularly if you told them that you're not sure. And because of, we are all victims of compulsory monogamy, and we are all victims of compulsory heterosexuality and all of the other things. And so a lot of these calls are me reminding people, you might not know until you know. And guess what? That's not your fault. It is your responsibility to tell the people that you're in a relationship with the truth about who you are and what you're learning, and to hold the space for their feelings when you do that as well. And to the extent that you take that on is your stuff, and therapy will help you unpack that.
Let's talk about the therapy thing, because like, I'm not a mandatory reporter. I don't know if you are. No.
I was when I was working with children, but I'm not anymore.
Exactly. And that's part of the thing that I really like about peer support, but does get super tricky, is because like, inevitably we're dealing with relationships. So I hear a lot of people who are in very abusive situations. I talk to couples where there's that clearly non-consensual power dynamic that's happening, and it gets challenging sometimes. And I'm a really big believer in transformative justice too, and saying like, even if you're doing something really bad, even if you're hurting your partner, like there are tools out there that can help you. You can both find a path forward, and I am not the person to be able to help you with that. I don't know, how do you deal with this? Because like, that's where for me all like the other resources and having like licensed clinicians that I know that I can refer people to is super important. How do you handle those things?
Very similar to you. So part of my training that I feel so lucky to have in those moments is something called telling the truth about myself. And so I will stop a session and say, I need to tell the truth about myself.
Yeah.
What's coming up for me in this moment is concerns around the dynamics of your relationship, possible toxic power struggles at play,
Yep.
and the ethics of consent involved in what I'm seeing right here. And that's when I come back to, I am happy to be somebody who can hold the transformative justice space and remind you that you are human and that you are deserving of good things and that we all make mistakes. But it's about how we take responsibility for those mistakes. And then I will continue to tell the truth about myself that I do not feel that this is within my scope to handle. So I am going to end the interaction and the call and offer a refund for myself. It has nothing to do with you or anything about your relationship. It is all my stuff and what's coming up for me right now. And that I think it's ethical for who I am and what I do here to end this call. And here are some resources.
Gotcha. Yeah. And I think it is kind of tricky. Like, I don't know, because I do peer support for polyamory people, but also for a range of other stuff, mainly sex education. And under that, I do talk to a lot of people who've experienced sexual violence, and I talk to offenders who have perpetrated sexual violence, who are self-identifying, coming to me because they have noticed how these like patterns of violating people's consent are damaging their relationship and their ability to have fulfilling sex lives. And they're really, really challenging questions. And I think this is where, like I hear a lot of people just want to be peer support mentors, and I think that's fucking awesome. Like I think we need such a wide range of people with a variety of different skills, but there are definitely situations where it is really heavy and like it is super, super tricky and very, very loaded on our shoulders how we navigate these spaces, right? For me, like the way I go about doing this is saying like, we're going to focus on consent. No, you cannot tell me in graphic details as a survivor about the ways that you have violated other people, right? I'm going to go ahead and assume that what you're telling me is true, but I'm not here to judge you. And we're just going to focus on how we can, like create safer sex practices moving forward. But the first couple of calls that I had, topic certainly did not go down that way. You just have to have those how do I say it? Like the integrity as a mentor to be like, there are going to be situations where you are not fucking prepared whatsoever, and it's important to be able to have that like recognition of where your skills are and where they aren't, and what you want to develop as skills and what you don't. Like for me, it became really important to be able to say like, oh, I've had 2 calls in this month about this with these types of clients, and I don't fucking know how to handle it. So let me go ahead and do some training, do some reading, really like get a much more robust understanding of how to, thoughtfully and compassionately go through these conversations in a way that's actually going to be productive for people.
Good for you. I think what makes, this unregulated, peer support field ethical, I think if I had to lay out a basis, it would be one that all peer support people are clear about their identity and don't coach outside of their identity or their training. So like both. That you're clear about that. So somebody can go to your website, your social media page, and know all of the pieces of your privilege and identity. And then 2, that your scope and that you are quick to identify your scope and end calls when it's outside of your scope. And 3, that you have feedback forms that are easily accessible so that when people are, and that those forms are going to a third party. And so mine go to a restorative justice person. And then clients have the option of, do you want to heal this with a restorative justice mediator, or did you just want to get the information out there?
Sure.
Like, what would you like to be done about this, which is part of restorative justice? I think, to me, off the top of my head, those are like the 3 legs of ethics. I think the community needs to focus more on education of encouraging people how to hire someone. I think there's a lot of random gatekeeping of like, oh, people out here with only 3 years trying to be coaches, and it's like, well, to someone that might be useful information, right? And if I maybe I want to talk to someone who specifically has 3 years experience for whatever reason. If I am opting into this call based on that information and you have been clear that you have only been doing it for 3 years, then to me, that's sort of a let grown folks do what they want type of thing. I just think people need to stay fucking humble to like, we also make mistakes. I think one question I would ask somebody I was potentially engaging in peer support with is, how do you handle feedback on the call and after? If I were to complain about something, how would you handle that? I think a lot of people are out here thinking that they receive feedback really well when they actually don't, and that comes out in times of trial. This is where my having a restorative justice background through not being trained, but through having gone through it. So that big fallout I told you where I lost my business, restorative justice healed that. Took 2 years. So having been someone who's gone through that, I am like able to kind of hold the space for it. But I think people think that they have a concept of how they handle feedback or how they show up in a space, and they actually have no idea, and that's the nature of the ego, which kind of leads me to a question I have for you. Have you ever used peer support?
Yeah, I have, and I think it's super helpful because, again, it's like this situation where sometimes I don't want therapy. Like, it's not about therapy, right? I just want to hear like, okay, I'm coming to terms with my gender identity, I need help. Like, this isn't necessarily like a therapeutic question. I just want to know, what was the process of transitioning like for you? And did you have to go through medical transition? You didn't? Okay, like, how did you come to the terms of like, this is enough for me? You know, like, this is how I feel good. Social transition is enough. Like, that was a huge question for me, and just being able to say like, oh yeah, there are people who are talking about this and talking about this really, really, really well. You know, I think it's really useful. And again, like, just the more that we know other peer mentors, like, the better our community is. Because I definitely get requests where I'm just like, ding, this other person would be great for you to talk to. You know, like, you have children, I don't. I am deliberately childless, so like, I'm not going to be able to help you with how to arrange, you know, your family. But there are these folks who, you know, have this expertise who you can talk to instead. So that's like, yeah, it's both for me, like, for my personal growth, but also for my professional development of just making connections within this network. And yeah, I definitely like agree with what you were saying about how, like, every profession, some people are crushing it and some people just aren't. And it's kind of hard to know before you go into a peer support session, like, who's going to work out for you. But you know, it's the same thing with therapists. I think there's a lot of people that are great.
Yeah, the same thing, the same toxic shit is happening with licensed therapists, especially to queer folks or anyone whose identity deviates from the colonial white supremacist capitalist norm. And so I sent you that Medium article. Like, I go to Evita Sawyer's for my peer support because everything she posts resonates with me, and I feel called to work with her as a mother, as a person who came to monogamy through, or polyamory through monogamous marriage. Like, I resonate with her. I feel like she sees me, and therefore I can pay cash, and I cannot find a therapist within my insurance network to save my life, especially one that is poly affirming and queer affirming. It's just, it's bad. It's all bad. And all of their training is not anti-colonial, and so everything is tainted, to be honest. And so, like, we're all just out. There is nothing happening in peer support that is not also happening within licensed therapy, and I think that doesn't absolve either of them, but I think it just changes the discussion a little bit.
And I think that's where I'm saying, like, there is no right or wrong answer objectively. Like, some people benefit from peer support just like some people benefit from therapy. Some people do not benefit from therapy. Some people do not benefit from peer support. With everything, you know, we can talk about like medicine too. Some people are really into Western medicine. Some people don't fuck with that at all. Like, say that there is one right or wrong, one absolute for any of this, to me, is a little myopic. You're saying that people should not be reaching out for the resources that feel comfortable for them. Like, a lot of folks, especially those of us who are queer, you know, have been hurt by traditional psychology, have been hurt by faith leaders, have been hurt by a bunch of these institutions that were put in place to help them. And so to have a conversation that is really casual, even if there exists a power hierarchy, does feel a lot safer than some of the other avenues. And to me, this comes back down to, like, again, your choice. Like, if you don't want to be a peer client, fine. Like, nobody is forcing you. If you don't want to get therapy, no one is forcing you. If you don't want spiritual counseling, no one is forcing you. And if you do, great. Like, find the people who you resonate with. I think that's so much more important than anything else. You know, I come back to, like, this is a little bit of a, how do I say, like a spiral in a slightly different direction, but during peer support, I always talk to folks about, like, their friends and their community and their network. Like, who are you going to for support outside of this call? And it's like, there are going to be some friends that are going to give you really, really, really valuable feedback because they see you, they recognize who you are, they're here for you, they're not inserting themselves into your life, they are making you, like, have the final say of what works. And then there are friends who are going to say, nope, there is one right way to do things, and it is my way, it is my view of life.
Touche. And that's why, for me, instead of just throwing the baby out with the bathwater, to use a terrible idiom, people need peer support. And so we need to focus our content on educating folks how to hire a peer support person, questions they should be asking, making sure that marginalized identities have access to peer support from people who look like them and have had their experience, and that can be as anti-colonial as is necessary, especially because even access to higher education for marginalized identities to become therapists is really hard. I feel like we can never be perfect. This came up earlier, and what a perfect way to tie up this conversation. We can't be perfect. So all we can do is be honest, continue to march forward, continue to show up in the space, because the amount of thank you letters and fan mail that I know you and I both get means I have to keep going.
Yeah. And again, like, it comes back down to, like, we get better at our jobs the longer that we do it, right? Like, pretty much everybody. I can speak for myself. Like, the reason why I'm doing this, it's not to make money. Like, this is, I'm sure, as you know, like, not a lucrative career path, right? This is part of the bigger arching art project that I personally do, right? Like, answering people's calls about non-monogamy works because people want to ask me questions about non-monogamy, right? They are still asking for this resource, so I will continue to provide it for them. If people are coming to me and being like, you know what, this wasn't useful for me, at that point, I'm going to be like, you're right, like, I am tapped out, I'm burnt out, I don't want to do this anymore, and I will pull myself out. And I think there just has to be that like, ability to recognize that peer support isn't fucking magic. Like, it's not to say that I have no impact on these people's lives. These conversations are important, but they're not also. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. Is like, after an hour, people might come out with, like, some books and some ideas and potential solutions that they can
validation, permission to live, permission to be who they are.
Permission to be who they are. But at the end of the day, like, if you choose not to read the book, I'm never gonna know. I don't give a fuck. Like,
you're not getting a grade.
Right. And it's not to say that I don't care about the people who I'm talking to, but, like, I don't care in the sense that I'm not invested in their lives. Like, there's no stakes in it for me. Like,
everything is okay. And I think, as always, we have to keep our lens on the systems of oppression in place that make it impossible for peer support people who are burnt out and ethically need to walk away, not able to walk away because they need the funds, right? And these are power systems in place that we are victims to, and so we have to constantly keep ourselves oriented that way. Well, you are a joy.
I do have a question. Now I'm really curious. Like, I know what my opt-out plan is that something that you've considered yet? Like, do you have like, what happens if I can't do this anymore backup? 'Cause I don't think we ever
I
talk about this as peer mentors, right? That we should have some way to opt out.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. And as always, it's a privilege, right? To have these backup plans, right? And so I'm trying to focus more on media creation as an income. So we are releasing a book on, parenting and polyamory, young children, and I'm hoping that that leads to further book deals and materials that can be purchased that can fund my life that way, and then I can continue. So weird tie-in. Midwives have some of the highest burnout rates of all medical providers, which everyone has higher burnout rates because they are not respected by the field, right? And they are basically fighting for your right to birth how you want to birth, and it's rough. It is rough. I respect my midwives more than anybody in this world. It is super important for there to be a network of safe birthing possibilities so that all midwives who are operating can honestly say, I can take 7 clients this year instead of 40, right? Because I need 40 to survive and thrive in this world. But the truth is, a midwife should have maybe 1 to 2 clients a month in order to be showing up as the best version of themselves. And so I think as peer support specialists, we need to be doing that as well. And we're all just doing our goddamn best. What's your backup plan?
I'm gonna be a bud tender. I love smoking weed so much. Like, I am already ready. Like, the second that I am done with this, like, I'm an artist. I don't need a fuck ton of money. Like, doodling is my life. I doodle, I garden, like, I grow weed. And when I'm done doing peer support, when people are like, you know what, Sam, shut up your advice, we don't want it, we don't want your suggestions, we don't want anything, I'll be like, perfect, find me in my garden.
and then you can take that as a sign of, it's time for me to retire. I don't need to prove myself. It's just time. Everyone has their heyday, right?
Exactly.
It's like making a TV series, and instead of just like going on too long and it becoming crap, you just go out high and you're like, all right, I'm out, I'm done.
Literally high, like, and I think that's really it for us. Like, what I love about you is the self-awareness, right? It's that this isn't about me at the end of the day. Like, I am here as your slate to bounce ideas off of me. And when you no longer need me, I'm not offended. Like, that's okay. That is fine. It's so okay. When one day polyamory is like hopefully a mainstream thing that people understand and I don't have to define for them what, like, hopefully
you don't need me anymore.
Right. Yeah. When everyone knows about compersion, when everyone is conversing, like, great, I will go find something else to do, but until then you can call me, and hopefully I'll be there for folks who want it.
You are a joy. I love your brain, I love your art, I love everything that you make, I love who you are, how you show up. It was a joy to talk to you. How can folks find you?
You can find me obviously at Shrimp Teeth on Instagram. It's shrimpteeth.com.
And you have a Discord, which is exclusive to your Patreon, and people can join your Patreon and get so many wonderful resources.
You find the stuff that you need.
All right. Okay, well, thank you so much, my friends, for listening to Remodeled. If you want to support us, you can find our Patreon. It's Homeslice Productions, because, as you all know, I'm ADHD and I don't have one brand. So thank you so much for listening.
Good. Well, I'm so happy you invited me on. It was so nice to talk to you.
I fall in love just a little bit every day with someone new. I fall in love just a little bit every